This is the original prototype mould for the face mask bands that I've just done, and I don't need this anymore, but the friend who asked me to make these bands in the first place, he does a lot of woodworking, and he has a four-sided thicknesser planer. It doesn't actually do four sides, it just does two, so you get a right angle on your wood, which means you can then just flip it over and do the other side, so it amounts to doing four. But that's obviously got a power feed mechanism going through it, and it has 40 slats, which are coincidentally about the length of this, and they're a bit worn. They're actually just a square section, about 300 long and about 40 wide, and these are 300 long and 32 wide, which is probably going to be enough. And there are a couple of screw holes for mounting these onto the conveyor, so it's a bit like a sort of caterpillar track. And he's already taken one of these and glued it on top and found that that does work quite well. So what I'm going to do is put this plate back on the milling machine and take out all of this geometry. This has gone down to 2 millimeters. The clasps were 1 millimeter, sorry, on the band, and the clasps went down to 2 millimeters. So if I take the whole thing down to a little over 2, say 2.1, and then maybe put some kind of tread patterns on it just to give it a bit more grip, then in theory these can be glued on top of the existing slats. The slats are available, but they're pretty expensive from what I hear, and he needs 40 of them. Plus he knows another guy who's got a similar machine, and he probably needs some as well. So it shouldn't be too difficult to do this. All I've got to do is realign it, chop it down, cut some tracks in, get that done this afternoon, and then mould some off in this rubbery Santoprene, and hopefully that will fix the machine at a relatively cheap cost. This is the plate back on the milling machine, and aligning this is a two-step process. The first step is to make use of the bolt holes I've got, which are at a known location. All I need to do is come back in with exactly the same bit that I cut them with, which is an 8mm slot drill, and then if I come down and pick up that hole, zero. There we go. So that's now in the hole, and I can clamp this end. Like so. It needs to be fairly loose. That's good. And now all I need to do is jog to the other end and pick up that hole, and then shuffle back and forth a couple of times, and then in theory that will be aligned. And then to do it even more accurately, I've got these little L-shaped referencing points which I cut in with a 1mm dental burr actually, and again if I come in with the same cutter and pick these points up, I can just adjust the plate or the location of the spindle itself, and that will give me a almost perfect alignment. Generally I can get to about 50 to 100 microns doing it this way, and then I know this plate is exactly where it was when I cut it, plus or minus a few tens of microns. So then I just need to pick up the top surface and buzz it all down to 2 millimeters. Okay, that's roughly in the right place. Try and get that as accurate as I can. I'll probably do. This doesn't need to be superbly accurate, but I like to do things as well as I can on this machine. Now I need to squint at this and see how far out I am. Tiny fraction. That looks pretty good. So now I just need to go to the other end and check on one of the other referencing points. I've actually got 4 of these which I can pick up, so that'll take a couple of minutes, and then we've got the thing back where we want it. Well, that's about as good as I'm prepared to get it. It's not absolutely spot on, but these carbide burrs, they've only got a sort of 1.6mm shank on them, and they're pretty difficult to chuck in this thing. I could swap out for a collet set, but it's this doesn't need to be enormously accurate. So I think we're probably within about 50 to 100 microns. We might get a slight step either side, but it's not going to matter because it's all going to be cut down. And if I was really bothered about it, I could actually make the new geometry a fraction wider just so that it all comes out perfect. But it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to take these walls off first, 4 of those, and then just drop down to 2mm and clear that pocket out. We are done. A little bit of a clean up. Right, well, the alignment seems pretty good. There's no obvious dog leg at either side. It's slightly rough along this edge, which suggests maybe I was a fraction too far this way. There's a slight ridge down the centre, but I think that will come off with a little bit of wire wool. Yeah, that's gone. And the edge will probably clean up a little bit as well. So there's our cavity. Now all I've got to do is come in and do some zigzag tyre tracks on here to give it a bit of grip, and I'm going to do those with a 4.5mm carbide slot drill. So I've just got to go 3 chevrons, and then that's it. And I can stick it in the machine and run about 50 of them off. And we're done. A bit of a sweep, and that looks pretty good. So I'll clean that up with a little bit of wire wool, and we'll have a go at moulding it, see how they do. Here's a quick look at the finished mould before we proceed. It looks reasonably good. I've given it a rub down. A couple of bits that could be improved. On the slats that this is going to be stuck on, there are actually a couple of bolt holes at either end. And obviously sticking this in situ, you're not going to be able to clamp it, so that could be a problem. So for this version, you just have to drill them through in the right place and take the slats off, stick this on, and then you've got the screw holes available to put it back on. What I could do is come in from behind and put a couple of pins in here and here, so that when it shuts off it creates a gap in the moulding, so then it's easier to assemble these back onto the machine and no need for drilling them. The other thing is how well the glue is actually going to hold to this, because it is going to be quite soft on the other side, quite flush. It is a fairly grippy material, and I think just brushing this up with a bit of sandpaper or a wire brush should probably give it enough texturing to glue on. The slats themselves are already pretty much had it, so I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem scuffing those up either. And it's just a case of whether or not I need to make a face plate to actually put some cross-hatch texturing on the back to give the glue a little bit more, of something to bite on and adhere a little better. So I'll worry about those later. We'll just mould a load of these off, see if they actually do the business, and then I'm sure there's other people out there with similar machines. I'm not entirely sure what make and model it is, but apparently the slats are quite expensive and you need 40 of them. So if this works, maybe there's other people out there who might want to order a load. It's not going to be enormously cheap because this material is getting on for £10 a kilo, and I think I'm probably going to be using at least a kilo of plastic, so we might be looking at sort of 20-25 quid by the time it's all said and done. But if it fixes a problem for people, and we'll know in the next few days hopefully, then maybe that's something that other woodworkers will be interested in. But first things first, I'll put this in the machine and we'll give it a squirt and see if they actually come out okay. Right, well, they look pretty good. They're still quite warm coming off the machine. Very warm. There's an obvious weld line down the middle, but that's not a problem, and I need to snip these off. But otherwise, that feels fairly grippy. So with a bit of luck, they will do. Now I've just got to mould off another 40 of them. Everyone's a winner. Well, that didn't take very long at all. I got 40 odd here, plus a few rejects as I was starting it up. About 21 grams each. Cycle time of about 18 seconds. Can probably have gone a bit quicker than that, to be honest, but yeah, it's like 10-15 minutes. It probably took longer to warm the machine up than it did to actually mould these things. They do have a reasonably good grippy feel to them. This is a fairly soft Santoprene, which I picked up years ago. I don't actually know which grade it is. It's basically a synthetic rubber, ethylene propylene diene monomer, EPDM, and it's copolymerized with polypropylene to stiffen it up. And depending on how much polyprop they put in, you can either have something that's fairly soft and flexible and feels more rubbery, up to something which is a little bit stiffer. And because I wanted to colour these bands that I've done recently, and because they needed to be fairly grippy, this is the material I went for. And this is an uncoloured Santoprene. It's a slightly harder grade. This I suspect is about an 80A shore hardness, whereas this is a 50D, which is probably about 100A on the A scale. Not that they perfectly overlap, but it's still reasonably similar. It's still fairly grippy, and obviously this is a bit stronger to take the elastic on the pips at the end. So that's worked reasonably well, and this has worked reasonably well for these. It's quite an interesting material, this EPDM, because it doesn't actually melt as such. You can heat it to soften it, but it's actually a shear thinning material. So basically when you apply enough shear force to this, it will turn into a liquid and you can mould it. It's kind of the opposite of that corn flour and water mix that kids play with, where that's a liquid and then you hit it with force and it turns into a solid. This does the exact opposite. I'm not sure you can get this for 3D printers because it doesn't really behave like a normal polymer would, but it's pretty easy to work with from a moulder's point of view. You just hit it with enough force and it goes in. Also means it sets up really quickly. You don't need a lot of cooling for this. Basically, as soon as it stops flowing, it solidifies. They do come out quite hot, but they're not warping and distorting like they might if it was a normal thermoplastic. So they've run okay, about 15 minutes, and I've got 40 of them. So we'll stick them on those treads on the conveyor belt and see if it does the job. And if anybody else wants them, then possibly I'll have to revise the design, make it a bit better, and run off some more. I've still got a bit of this material left, but I can always get some from one of my suppliers if I do run out. So there we go, quick project for the day.